Right, I've talked about physical conversation. Now I want to talk about conversation. The idea that I know I can do Kung Fu, which is a physical art, but is there such a thing as conversation Kung Fu? That is to say, I know I can do Kung Fu, which is a physical conversation, but can I do conversation Fu? That is to say, can I augment my conversation, improve my skill at conversation, my skill at interacting with people in words, in the same way as I can improve my skill at interacting with people physically? And the answer is of course, yes, of course you can. You just have to practice. But this then brings up the question as to what exactly do you practice? If you went up to someone and said, I want to practice having a conversation with you, then that leaves, even if they sort of don't look at you strangely, if they've agreed that they're practicing and you're practicing and it's just there as an exercise, if they've agreed, then it does leave the question open as to what exactly should we talk about. And through experience, what I have found is that when two people have a conversation, especially one which is not sort of just an exchange of pleasantries, what they often try and do is attempt to express their version of reality. Now, everyone has a different version of reality. What happens is we all live different lives and therefore have different experiences and therefore have different ways of understanding the world in which we live. And what we try and do in conversation, or what people tend to try and do in conversation, is to express that understanding of the world in which we live, which is fair enough. That's the whole purpose of conversation. That's the whole purpose of communication. The only problem with this is where it starts to break down is when people have different views of the world. And this happens more often than you think. And furthermore, what tends to happen, rather than resolving those different views of the world, they just get stuck. So you reach a point in a conversation where you can't agree, and you simply have to agree to disagree. And so you're not actually moving forward with the conversation. In other cases, you have one person who tends to be slightly stronger in their view of the world than another person, and they tend to sort of manipulate the other person, at least temporarily, into sort of taking on board their opinion. And really this doesn't do either of them any good either. So with this grating of realities, what I found was that if, rather than talk about what our respective views of reality were, what might be more productive is to actually construct a reality together. So rather than competing with each other and getting nowhere, I thought it might be a good idea to actually build on each other's words. So what we do in order to do this, rather than construct a view of reality which we're bound to disagree about, what we're going to do is construct a fiction together. So in order to achieve this, one person would say a paragraph which would begin a story, and the other person would say another paragraph which continued that story, and so on and so forth. And what I found from doing this is that it does indeed deliver what I wanted it to do, which is to allow people to talk to one another continuously in a sort of very abstract way. Because what you've got to remember about stories is, as we're telling them, they're influenced by what's going on inside our head. Because I never know exactly what I'm going to say from one moment to the next. So when I create a story, it's an expression of myself, but it's not a direct expression of what I think. It's more of an expression of what I am thinking. So it's by telling the story, you're holding back less, but it is an abstract communication. So the story unfolds and has naturally has a beginning, a middle and an end. And, you can have different types of stories. Often they're determined by the beginning of the story, or how the story is going to pan out, what type of story it's going to be. So what this does is it just gets people talking to one another, and it carries them on talking to one another, which is the brilliant thing about it. Because as I was saying, if you talk to someone for long enough, you're bound to find a point you disagree on, and that sort of puts a nail into the conversation, and you don't really know how to move forward. By learning this way of communicating, we're always looking for a way to build on what the other person's saying, rather than to attempt to knock it down and replace it with our own view on things. So again, you've got to ask the question, why would anyone want to do this? Well, it's actually quite enjoyable, but other than the fact that it's quite enjoyable, why would anyone want to do this? And I think that, like the physical conversation, it builds a bridge. It develops a bond with another person. You're developing a kinship through it. And yes, you can do this through normal conversation, but the things you disagree on about the world are always going to get in your way. And therefore, the only people that you can have a kinship with are people who are exactly like you. And I think that's not right. I think you should be able to have a kinship with people who aren't exactly like you and do think different things to you. Now, this form of communicating, or rather this form of using words to interact with one another, obviously rubs off onto real conversation, and it stops you from always jumping on onto the idea of the other person's wrong and here's why kind of approach to communication, and this is why I'm right. So it makes for a more overall, generally pleasant exchange. But you may be thinking, well, what if I really want to convince someone of something? Well, you've got your work cut out. You can state your point, but if it contradicts their experience, or if you're referencing experience which doesn't fit, which they don't have, then they're unlikely to accept it just because you say it. If you really want to convince someone of something, then you need to give them an experience. And it's the experience that will convince them of that thing. This is the basis of a sort of scientific method of peer review. If I create an experiment, essentially I'm subjecting myself to an experience. And if I explain how other people can create that experiment and therefore subject themselves to that experience, if what I read into that experience is correct, then they will read in the same thing to it, and we'll get an agreement, and there will be a way of communicating the idea without having to assert it in a dogmatic way. So that's my thoughts on conversation foo.